Years ago, I remember working with a particular student who was very not motivated. They didn't want to be there. The only reason they were there is because their parents forced them to be there. I didn't really enjoy working with them because it's a very frustrating experience from a teacher's perspective. And you can try to create excitement and motivation with this student, but it just takes so much work. And at the same time, you feel like you're giving this one student so much focus, you're reducing the amount of focus you can give to your other students as well. Like the students that are really good, you want to give them more attention because they're motivated and they're engaged, but you can't because you're spending all of your time on this not motivated student. But then at the same time, you think, well, what is my role? I need to help the student because they need the help the most. And I remember one day speaking with the parents of this particular unmotivated student. And we were in a consultation in my office, and the parents, they looked at me and they said, Justin, I'm not very happy because I don't feel like he's more motivated. And I said, well, what do you mean? I don't understand. And he said, well, I expect that when he's in your lessons and he's in your classes, that he will become more motivated, but I feel like he's still just as not motivated. And it sort of hit me. I was still relatively early on in my teaching experience back then. I'd only been teaching for maybe a couple of years. And it hit me at that point that the parents expect me to solve all of the problems of their child. The student that was only there because they were forcing them to be there, the student that clearly had no interest in this, that didn't want to be engaging, I was the one who needed to make them engage. And frankly, this hasn't changed. Parents still expect teachers to solve a lot of these problems. They still expect that motivation is something that will be trained by a teacher, and they expect that a good enough teacher should be able to create enough motivation in the student. And maybe in a perfect world that is true, but again, we don't live in a perfect world, and the resources and time and the emotional investment it would take for that one student, it's not viable to have that kind of approach. But it doesn't change the fact that at the end of the day, the accountability and the responsibility all ends up falling on the teacher's shoulders. And so I have this concept now that I call the enablers of effective learning. And the way I see it is this. There are the cognitive processes that a student engages in. And these are the processes that allow them to understand information and to retain that information and eventually retrieve that information for an exam or any other type of assessment. However, this series of cognitive processes, and in some cases, it's a skill that has been learned over such a long period of time that it's simply just a habit. People don't even understand what process they're using, but they just do it subconsciously because it's become a habit. But like any habit, it can be trained and out-trained and overtrained. So this skill, in order to improve the skill or change the skill to one that's more effective, this student needs to have certain other attributes and skills that gives them the opportunity to improve. So, for example, if the student procrastinates so much that they never actually get any studying done, well, it doesn't matter if you teach them a better studying technique, they're never going to use it. So in that case, they weren't able to succeed, not because they didn't know the right technique, but because they weren't enabled to use that technique. And so I call this enablers: time management, stress management, task management, overall something that I just call self-management. And so it's incredibly important that we as teachers are developing self-management and enablers in the students first, because it avoids a lot of unnecessary wasted energy and wasted time. There are a lot of different ways that teachers have been instructed to design their lessons. Lots of different pedagogies: problem-based learning, case-based learning, scenario or simulation learning, inquiry-based learning, collaborative learning, games-based learning. The list goes on. Unfortunately, when you look at the research around how effective these strategies actually are, there is a lot of variation. Some studies show that it's very successful, and other times it doesn't seem to be very good, and in some cases it can actually even make it worse for some students. And now, when studies have looked at that, why is it that these pedagogies are not successful. What it's found is that if the self-regulation part of it is missing, then it doesn't work. And I want to give you a very common example of why this is important and how that links to the idea of enablers. Let's say that you give your student a certain instruction. You say, Jeff, I want you to do this particular task. And you give them the instructions, and every other student is able to do it. But for Jeff, they can't. They struggle to do it. They're just not able to complete this task. Now, often, what teachers will do at that point is that they will think about ways to make this task more manageable, or they'll guide them through the task to assist them in the parts that they find the most difficult. And therefore, this task and activity is more manageable for Jeff. This is very common. However, when we look at the recent research on effective learning, those types of solutions can actually, in some cases, make things worse. And that is because what we have done is that we have avoided desirable difficulty. Now, desirable difficulty refers to the fact that certain things that are good for us might also be difficult. These difficulties are not things that we should avoid. These difficulties are things that we should embrace. So for example, if you intend to get stronger and you go to the gym and lift some weights, and these weights are heavy and you struggle to lift them, well, that is desirable difficulty. That weight, that difficulty is making us stronger. Likewise, in learning, the difficulty associated with certain types of thinking are actually desirable. And when we circumvent this by making it more manageable for the student, what we are doing is we are bypassing the need for this student to learn that skill. We're saying this weight is too heavy, let me help you to lift it. And so as a result of doing that, we can run into a phenomenon called the fade out effect. The fade out effect refers to, especially in education, when learners are given tasks and instructions and it is made too easy for the learner. It is made too manageable. And so later on, even if they previously did quite well, they can underperform. So they can do well short term, but they can do worse long term because they never learned the skills to deal with the difficulty when it got too complicated. Because at a certain point, either because you're not their teacher anymore or simply because the topic is just too hard, there is only so much you can do to make it easier for the student. And if at that point they don't have the skills to make it easier for themselves, then there's trouble. And that's called the fade out effect. And we do not want to create the fade out effect. And I know that it's tempting with curriculums and performance assessments. Your students need to perform well in the short term as well. I understand that. But we can't let the short-term success be the priority if we know that it's going to cause long-term harm. And we also can't close our eyes to the evidence. We can't hope and assume that it's not going to have that negative impact when the research says that it really might. But there's an alternative. There is an alternative. We don't have to sacrifice that short-term success. And we can help them have long-term success too. And the way that we do that is through teaching our students the ability for self-regulation, these important enablers. And so what I'm going to introduce is what I think is the enabler of all enablers. When we look at research around procrastination, focus, distractibility, engagement with learning, intrinsic motivation of learning, the ability to perform academically, the ability to grow over time, the ability to modify their learning strategies to fit their goals, the ability to actually not only perform well in assessments, but also to proactively look for their mistakes before and embrace those mistakes, something that we call the growth mindset. When we look at the research around all of these things, there is something that is fundamental to all of it. So much to the point where trying to develop these things without having this key ingredient, the research has shown that it is much more challenging and in some cases just downright potentially impossible. It's kind of like the flour to baking. If you don't have flour, it doesn't matter how much salt or sugar or butter you have. It's hard to make most things. And so what is this core ingredient? What is the enabler here that enables all of these other things? Some of you may already know the answer to this. It is a very hot topic and still one that I feel has less attention than it deserves. That is the idea of training metacognition, the thinking about thinking, the awareness of the thought processes. So it's not just about studying with a certain technique, but it's about understanding, monitoring, and observing. What am I actually doing right now? Why am I doing that? What is the cause and effect relationship here? And once we understand that and we can see it from a, not just in the task, focused on just trying to do the technique correctly, but being able to see from a higher angle what the process is that we're doing and see that objectively, we can now start modifying and tweaking that. And it doesn't matter what type of issue it is. We could be having issues with remembering information, understanding information, applying it in exams. Maybe it's only for a single subject. Maybe it's the distractions that we have. Maybe it's procrastinating. It doesn't matter. To solve any of these, not just short term, but long term as well, metacognition is critical. And trying to fix any of these with tips and tricks and techniques that do not train metacognition either will not work or will only work short term. Now, those of you that are familiar with the topic of metacognition, which will be many of you I know, also know that metacognition is an incredibly large topic. There are many facets of metacognition. The one I want to talk to you about today is the metacognition related to what is called higher order thinking and higher order learning. Higher order thinking refers to the critical thinking skills, the processes that our brain engages in to compare and contrast, to evaluate, to analyze deeply information, to prioritize information, and to even create and synthesize new information from our existing knowledge. This is the type of thinking that employers want to see in employees. This is a type of thinking that university graduates need to have to excel in their studies. This is a type of thinking that secondary school students need to have to excel in their assessment. This is a type of thinking that exam questions try to test for to see who are the elite students from the average students. And with the modern student operating where there is an infinite amount of information that they can access, with so much to learn and so many assessments, and including now artificial intelligence coming into the picture, changing the landscape completely, the value of simply knowing information is going down and will continue to go down rapidly. Simply knowing things will not be enough. What will provide the value, and what right now, even currently, provides the most value, is being able to manipulate that information and to look deeper into that information, to find relationships and interactions, and to generate and synthesize information from that. That process requires a lot of thinking. It requires a lot of cognitive effort, something that is called cognitive load. This is the perceived effort mentally that it takes to do this kind of thinking. It takes much more effort up here to think about things in a way that we're comparing and contrasting and grouping and evaluating and prioritizing and saying, oh, this is more important than this, but in this situation, this is maybe more important, and that creates this. This type of thinking is very complicated. And it takes much more effort than simply saying, this is a word, this is a definition. This is the word, this is the definition. This is the word, here's the explanation. When I see this problem, I answer it this way. When I see this problem, I answer it this way. How do most of your students tend to learn? Be honest. Most of the time, most students are in that lower order of thinking. Not only does lower order thinking and lower order learning detriment academic performance, but it is also less transferable into university and the workforce, and it is going to become increasingly more irrelevant as artificial intelligence and the availability of data and information increases. This is the reality of the modern learner. It's no longer enough to have that superficial information. And whether the curriculum is changed now or will change next year or in a couple of years from now, it's only a matter of time. But learners right now and in the future will benefit from having higher order thinking and higher order learning skills. And so the ability of a student to engage in higher order thinking is partly determined by their cognitive load tolerance. And when I say cognitive load tolerance, what I mean is how much of that effort are they willing to tolerate before they say, no, this is too much, and then they stop doing it or they give up. If someone can tolerate a lot of cognitive load, they can do this complicated thinking more and for longer. Whereas if someone thinks it's getting a little difficult and then they give up straight away, then they can never engage in this higher order of thinking. So you can see the effect that that would have. When we look at research on this, unfortunately, we find that for most learners, they do not have very high cognitive load tolerance. Now, too much cognitive load is a bad thing. We don't want to just have students that are completely confused out of their minds all the time. But we also don't want students that have too little cognitive load and they're just learning passively, too superficially. We don't want that. We want right in that optimum band. There's enough cognitive load indicating that they're doing the right type of complicated thinking, but it's not so much that they're getting overwhelmed. However, the average learner does not tolerate enough cognitive load to get within that optimum band. In fact, this has been studied and is a phenomenon called the misinterpreted effort hypothesis. And it says that students encounter difficulty and then they interpret that as them being bad at this and not wanting to do it anymore and giving up. And so that desirable difficulty that shows that they're doing the right type of thinking to succeed and thrive, they don't like that because they don't realize it's actually good for them. And this is the good part, is that research has shown that when you train students to understand that that difficulty is desirable, when you train them and show them what type of thinking to do and the result that that thinking has and why that is good, it can help to increase the cognitive load tolerance of these individuals. It can help them to see that something is difficult and takes effort, but it's good for them and it will stop them from giving up. So to enable your students to succeed, there are a few key requirements that have to be met. And again, all of these things are things that any teacher can do no matter how busy you are.